The first time I walked back into that house, I thought my knees would give out before I even reached the front door. 5 years earlier, I had stood on the courthouse steps with Elena's hand in mine, both of us shaking so badly we could barely hold the marriage certificate between us. No flowers, no family, no blessings. Just two people who had run out of options and decided that love was either strong enough to survive the world or it wasn't worth calling love at all. Now I was back, standing under a sky the color of wet ash, staring at the same mansion that had once looked down on me like I was something clinging to the bottom of a shoe. The front door was open. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The second thing was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that lives in an empty house. This was the silence of people pretending not to hear the storm coming. I looked down at the small hand wrapped around my finger. My daughter Nora was 7 now, with her mother's dark eyes and the stubborn chin I used to see in Elena every time she was determined to prove somebody wrong. "Daddy," she whispered, peeking up at the house. "Do they hate us?" I swallowed hard. "No, baby," I said, though my voice came out rougher than I meant. "They're just confused." That was the clean version, the kinder version, the version I could say without making a child carry the weight of adult cruelty. Because the truth was, they had hated us. They had hated our love, our decision, our court papers, our empty apartment, our stubborn refusal to break apart just because they demanded it. They had hated that Elena, the daughter of a wealthy family with old money and polished manners, chose me, a mechanic's son with grease under his nails and no inheritance waiting in my name. They hated it so much that on the day we married, her father said I'd regret this before the first anniversary. He was wrong about the anniversary. He was wrong about a lot of things. But standing there in the doorway of that house 5 years later, with my daughter beside me and my wife's hand trembling in mine, I felt something I had never expected to feel again in that place. I felt afraid, not because I thought they could still break me, because I knew why we had been called back, and I didn't know whether the truth waiting inside that house was going to heal anything or rip open every scar we'd spent years learning to live with. Elena turned to me, her lips pressed into a line, the way they always did when she was holding herself together for the sake of everyone around her. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. I gave her a tired smile. "We already drove 3 hours. That's not what I mean." I knew what she meant. I knew because there had been a time when she would have walked into any fire for her family, no matter how badly they burned her. There had also been a time when she would have broken her own heart just to keep them from having to admit they were wrong. 5 years had changed her. It had changed me, too. "No," I said. "I have to do this." She searched my face. "For me?" "For all of us." Then the woman who had once been told she was ruining her future because she married beneath her class stepped closer, fixed my collar with 2 quick fingers, and whispered, "Stay next to me." I almost laughed at that. I had stayed next to her through every ugly thing life could throw at us. When our electricity was shut off for 3 days because we were 1 paycheck short. When her mother refused to answer the phone. When Elena cried in our kitchen because the only wedding photo we had was the one taken by a stranger's cell phone outside the courthouse. When my hands were so blistered from work, I could barely hold a fork. When our daughter was born and no one from her side showed up, even after Elena sent the same text twice, then 3 times, then gave up and stared at the hospital ceiling like she had expected grief to look different. I had stayed. I was still there. The house belonged to Richard Whitmore, Elena's father, a man who had built a fortune from nothing but a good eye, a hard jaw, and the kind of cold ambition that makes people call you brilliant as long as they never have to love you. The Whitmore house was all stone columns, trimmed hedges, and windows so tall they looked like they were built for people who never bent to pick anything up with their own hands. It sat on a hill at the edge of town like it was too important to share the ground with anyone else. When Elena and I first got together, her family had acted like I was a phase, the way some families treat a tattoo or a bad haircut, something temporary, something that would wash out. Then they found out I was serious. That's when the doors closed. Her mother, Diane, told Elena she was embarrassing the family. Her brother Marcus called me a leech, with a smile so polished it almost passed for good manners. Her father didn't even bother pretending to be kind. The first time I met him, He looked at my calloused hands and asked Elena right in front of me, "Is this really the life you want?" Elena said yes. That was the first battle. There were many more after that. But that day, when we went to the courthouse and got married with only one witness we barely knew, I remember something Elena said to me in the parking lot afterward. "They can keep their table settings," she said, wiping her eyes and trying to laugh. "I'll take the life we build." So we did. We built it in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaking sink and a heater that rattled all winter. We built it through overtime shifts, cheap takeout, and secondhand furniture. We built it on kindness, exhaustion, and a promise neither of us ever broke. And we built something else, too. We built a daughter. Nora had just been born when the first crack showed up in the Whitmore family walls. It started with a letter from Richard's attorney, asking Elena to sign a family waiver for future asset clarification, which sounded like corporate nonsense and smelled like trouble. Elena ignored it. Then came the phone calls, then the emails, then Marcus showing up at our apartment uninvited, wearing a navy coat and the kind of expression people wear when they think they're already winning. He stood in our doorway, looked around at our tiny place, and said, "You're still playing house?" Elena told him to leave. He smiled at me instead. "You know, if you just let her come home, this would all be easier." "She is home," I said. He laughed like I'd told a joke. That was Marcus, always smiling, always acting like he was above the mess while making sure somebody else had to clean it up. He had gone to a prestigious business school, married a woman from an equally rich family, and learned how to speak in a voice that made insults sound like advice. He was the son Richard had planned to put in charge of everything someday. The heir, the polished one, the one who understood the family business, the estate, the money, the image, and, from what I would later learn, the one who understood how to steal the most without getting caught. At the time, though, I only knew he hated me because I had what money couldn't buy: Elena's trust. That made me a threat. He came by 3 times that first year. The first time to offer Elena a deal. The second time to warn her that her father was sick and that she should think about the family before she made a permanent mistake. The third time to tell her that if she didn't come back, she'd be cut out of everything. Elena stared at him from our kitchen and said, "You mean if I don't come back and let you control everything?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "You've always had a talent for making things sound ugly, and you've always had a talent for pretending ugly things are clean." He left after that, but not before glancing at Nora asleep in her little crib and saying, "Pity she'll grow up without knowing where she came from." I almost stepped toward him. Elena caught my arm. "Don't," she said. "I still wish I had, because maybe then I would have seen what Marcus was really doing a year before the courthouse marriage. Maybe I would have understood that this family conflict was never just about class or pride. Maybe I would have seen the theft before it became a collapse. What I did know was this: the Whitmores had money, but they were drowning in it. Not the kind of drowning people see in movies, with broken banks and foreclosure notices taped to the door. This was the quieter kind, the kind where numbers were moved around in private, where companies got overextended, where bad decisions were dressed up as temporary setbacks, where one person's appetite slowly ate the whole table. Richard had spent decades buying properties, investing in developments, and collecting businesses like trophies. The family name mattered because the family made sure it mattered. But by the time Elena and I were settling into our little life, things had started to go wrong. A construction venture that should have made money lost millions. A holding company fell behind on taxes. A trust account was moved. A signature was forged. Not by Richard, by Marcus. We didn't know that yet. All we knew was that Richard had become meaner, quieter, and increasingly desperate. He tried to force Elena back by threatening to cut her out entirely. When that didn't work, he tried guilt, then silence. Then one day, he had a stroke so minor the family called it exhaustion instead. And everything changed. Elena wanted to go to the hospital. Marcus told her not to bother. "He doesn't want to see you," he said. That was a lie. I know that now. But at the time, Elena believed him. And that was the beginning of the worst year of our lives. We had our own bills, our own work, our own baby. We couldn't keep chasing the Whitmore's chaos. Elena learned to grieve her family in pieces. She never said it out loud, but I could see every time she passed a fancy restaurant, every time someone mentioned a sibling, every time a wedding invitation arrived in our mailbox for people she used to know. She was mourning something she had not fully lost yet. Then, 6 months after the stroke, Richard called her. Not Marcus, not Diane. Richard himself. He asked to see her alone. I still remember the way Elena looked at me when she got off the phone. Not hopeful, not relieved, terrified. He sounded old, she whispered. I squeezed her hand. We'll go together. She shook her head. He only asked for me. Then he can ask me too. But she wouldn't let me. She went by herself, stayed for 2 hours, and came back with her face completely blank. The way it gets when a person has already cried too much and there is nothing left but the shell around the hurt. What happened? I asked. She sat down at the kitchen table and stared at her hands. He asked if you were using me. I laughed once, sharply. That's what he said? That was the first thing. And the second? She swallowed. He said if I chose you over my family, I would lose everything. I dropped the dish towel I was holding. Everything? She nodded. He said Marcus was already handling the accounts because he's the only one who can keep the family business alive. Is that true? No. Then what did you say? Elena looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something in her face that scared me more than anger. She looked ashamed. I told him I was tired, she whispered. I told him I was tired of begging people to respect me. And he said he didn't know how I could live with myself, knowing I chose this life. This life? I said, my voice going flat. She nodded, tears finally spilling over. He called our apartment a mistake. I sat down across from her and reached for her hands. Listen to me, I said. That man is grieving control. That's all. He doesn't get to define your life. She cried then, hard and quiet, and I held her until she stopped shaking. A week later, we got another call. Then another. Then an envelope arrived by courier. Inside was a formal notice stating that Richard had amended pieces of the family trust and that Elena needed to appear before the attorney if she wanted any future consideration in the estate. That sounded like a bribe dressed up as paperwork. Marcus showed up that same evening with a better offer. He said the family would forgive Elena if she came back alone. He said they could help us. He said he could arrange a job for me in one of their companies if I stepped aside. That was the moment I realized something I had suspected for a while. They didn't just dislike me. They feared what Elena might become if she stayed with me long enough to understand her own strength. So I told Marcus to get out. He looked at me for a long second, then glanced at Nora sleeping in Elena's arms and smiled without warmth. You're both making a mistake, he said. Your daughter deserves better than a fantasy. Elena stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. Get out. He left, but not before dropping the sentence that would haunt us for years. When this family is done with you, he said, don't come crawling back. He shut the door behind him. That night, Elena held Nora against her chest and said, I can't keep doing this. Doing what? Hurting over people who only know how to hurt back. I kissed the top of her head, then stopped chasing them. She looked up at me. You don't understand. I understand that every time they call, they reopen a wound. They're my family, and I'm yours. That was the truth we kept returning to. Not because it was dramatic, because it was real. In the years that followed, we stopped waiting for the Whitmores to become the people Elena needed them to be. We stopped checking the phone after midnight. We stopped hoping. We worked. We raised Nora. We learned to build peace out of the smallest things. Shared coffee before dawn. Sunday pancake mornings, music in the car, laughter in our apartment so loud the neighbors probably thought we were crazy. I started my own renovation company with one truck, one borrowed ladder, and the kind of optimism people call foolish until it works. Elena went back to school part-time and became a social worker, the exact kind of person her family said she'd waste herself becoming. She took care of people who had nowhere else to go, which always made me smile because the family who claimed she was selfish had never once known how generous she could be. Nora grew up watching us work, laugh, argue, forgive, and keep going. Then, 5 years after the courthouse wedding, the call came. Not from Marcus, not from Diane, from Richard himself. He sounded different, thinner, weaker. His voice had the brittle edge of someone who had been losing a war in silence for a long time. "I want to see Elena," he said. Elena had gone quiet on the other end of the line. Then Richard added, after a long pause, "And I want you there too." I took the phone from her hand. "Why?" He exhaled shakily. "Because I'm done with secrets." That was enough to make my stomach turn. "We'll come," I said, though every part of me wanted to ask what exactly that meant. When I hung up, Elena was staring at me like she was trying to read the future from the shape of my face. "What did he say?" I hesitated. "He said he's done with secrets." Her eyes flickered. "That's not comforting." "No," I said. "It isn't." She sat down beside me on the couch. Nora was coloring on the floor, humming to herself with the total confidence of a child who had never had to wonder whether the adults in her life would show up for her. Elena looked at our daughter and then back at me. "Do you think it's finally over?" she asked. I didn't answer right away, because something in me had already begun bracing for impact. When we pulled up in front of the Whitmore house, Marcus was waiting on the front steps. Of course he was. He looked older than I remembered, but not in a softened way. Harder, sharper. The kind of aging that comes from a man who has spent too long smiling at people he plans to betray. His hair was lighter at the temples now, and there was a tension around his mouth that made his polished confidence look thin. He saw our car, then our daughter, and the expression on his face changed for half a second before he masked it. "That your kid?" he asked when Elena stepped out. "That's my daughter," Elena said coldly. Marcus gave a small nod, pretending not to notice the edge in her voice. "Funny. She has your eyes." He said it like a fact, but his gaze slid toward me with the same old contempt. "Richard's inside," he said. "He's not well. Keep this calm." I gave him a long look. "You don't get to decide what calm looks like anymore." His smile tightened. "Still playing the hero. And you're still talking too much." His eyes flashed. "You should be careful. This house has a way of reminding people where they belong." I stepped closer, until we were nearly chest to chest. "Then maybe today," I said quietly. "It remembers who stole from it." His face didn't change. That was the first sign. The second was the way his right hand clenched at his side. Elena touched my arm before anything else could happen. "Not here," she murmured. I took a breath, then nodded. We walked inside. The house smelled the same. Polish, old wood. Flowers that had been cut too early and arranged by somebody who cared more about appearance than warmth. The marble floor still shone like an accusation. The grand staircase still looked like it belonged in a museum, not a home. But the portraits on the wall had changed subtly, and the whole place felt dimmer, like somebody had turned the life down one notch at a time. Diane was in the sitting room. She looked frail, in a way that startled me. Her silver hair was pinned back, but the sharpness that had once made her seem untouchable was gone from her face. Age had softened her features, without making her kinder. If anything, she looked like a woman who had spent too many years standing beside the wrong man and now didn't know how to step away from the wreckage. She saw Elena and went still. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Nora, who had been hiding behind my leg, peeked out and asked in her small voice, "Are you Grandma?" Diane's expression cracked. She put a hand over her mouth like she had been punched by something invisible. Elena's face tightened. "Nora, stay close to Daddy." But Diane was already standing. "She's—" Diane began, then stopped, her voice trembling in a way I'd never heard before. "She's beautiful." No one answered. Across the room, Richard sat in a wheelchair near the window. He was thinner than I had imagined possible. His shoulders had folded in on themselves. His face was lined with pain. There was an oxygen tube near his chair, and his hands were veined and shaky. But his eyes were still sharp enough to pin a room in place. He looked at Elena for a long time, then at me. then at Nora. For a second, he looked like he might cry. Then his gaze settled on my wife, and his jaw tightened with all the old stubbornness still living under the illness. "You came," he said. Elena crossed her arms. "You called." He nodded once. "I did." Marcus was standing behind him, too close, his hand resting on the wheelchair handle like a man keeping his grip on a prize. I didn't like that. Not one bit. Richard motioned toward the sofa. "Sit." No one sat right away. I watched the room, watched Marcus, watched Diane, watched the way the staff moved quietly along the edges of the walls as if they had already learned not to exist too loudly around family. Finally, Elena sat, but only after pulling Nora onto her lap. Richard's eyes went to the child again. His lips parted slightly, and I saw something in him I had never seen before. Regret. Marcus noticed it too, and something cold crossed his face. Richard cleared his throat. "I asked you here," he said, "because there are things this family should have faced years ago." Marcus let out a short, uneasy laugh. "Dad, this isn't the time for old arguments." Richard's eyes cut to him. "It is exactly the time." The room went still. Richard inhaled slowly, as if each breath was expensive now. "Marcus," he said, "bring me the file." Marcus froze. The silence between them was not the silence of misunderstanding. It was the silence of a door already half open. "Dad," Marcus said carefully, "we talked about this." "We did," Richard said. "And now I'm done talking." Marcus's face hardened. "You're not thinking clearly." "I've never thought more clearly in my life." Elena looked between them, confusion and suspicion flickering across her features. "What file?" Richard didn't answer her. His eyes stayed locked on Marcus. "The file," he repeated. Marcus stepped back, his posture tightening. "No." That single word changed the air in the room. Diane made a small noise. Richard shut his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was a fierceness in them that cut through his illness like a blade. "You emptied the Westbrook account," he said. Elena blinked. "What?" Marcus's face didn't move. Richard kept going, voice rougher now. "You forged my signature on the transfer papers." I heard Elena inhale sharply. "You used the renovation contracts to hide the losses." Richard's hand was shaking so badly he had to grip the armrest. "You moved money through shell accounts under the foundation's name. You lied to the board. You lied to your mother. You lied to me." Marcus stared at him. Then he laughed. It wasn't a natural laugh. It was the kind that comes from someone trying to force confidence through panic. "You've been sick," he said. "You're confused." Richard's face turned hard with disgust. "I'm sick, not blind." Now Marcus's smile vanished. I felt Elena go rigid beside me. Richard reached toward the side table, and Diane flinched as if she already knew what he was reaching for. He picked up a thick manila envelope with a handwritten label across the front. "5 years ago," he said. "I should have listened when Elena told me what kind of man you were becoming." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about Elena." "No," Richard said. "It's about my company, my name, my accounts, and the money you stole while I was recovering." Elena stared at Marcus. "You stole from him?" Marcus turned on her then, anger breaking through his polished mask at last. "You don't get to stand there looking shocked," he snapped. "You walked away. You chose your little apartment and your little life and left us to handle the mess." "By stealing?" I said. His gaze hit me like a stone. "By surviving." Richard wheezed, a harsh, ugly sound that made Diane move instinctively toward him. He waved her back. "Don't touch me," he said, then coughed. "Not yet." Diane froze, tears gathering in her eyes. Richard opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. "I brought everyone here," he said, "because I want the truth on this floor before I die." The room went dead quiet. I felt Nora shift against Elena's chest. I wanted to pull her away, to protect her from what was coming, but something told me this moment was already too far gone to shield her from. Richard looked at me for the first time with something that might have been respect, or maybe only exhaustion. "Adrian," he said. And hearing my name in his voice felt like stepping into a room I had spent years being barred from. "There's something you need to see." He handed me the top sheet. I took it. It was a bank statement, then another, then a transfer record, then a set of altered signatures, all tracing movement from the family trust into a private account tied to a company Marcus controlled. I felt my pulse kick hard in my throat. Then I saw the next document. A vendor invoice from my company. My name at the bottom. The amount was wrong. The work description was wrong. The date was wrong. It had been used as part of the paper trail. My stomach turned. "What is this?" Elena whispered. Marcus's face had gone pale. Richard's voice was cold now, stripped of almost everything except truth. A fraud scheme. Elena looked at Marcus. Disbelief, giving way to rage so fast it almost scared me. "You used our company name?" she said. Marcus raised his chin, as if he could still stand taller than the facts. "I used what was available. You lied to my husband. You left," he shot back. I looked at him then, and something in me settled into a place so still it felt dangerous. "This is why you wanted him to think I was using you," I said slowly. "Because you were covering your own tracks." Marcus didn't answer. Richard did. "He wanted you gone because you were too decent to ignore him," Richard said. "And because Elena, for all her loyalty, listens to you." I stared at the papers in my hands. It was suddenly all there. The strange calls, the pressure, the helpful offers. Marcus trying to steer Elena away from the family and keep her from asking questions. The hostile comments, the timing, the lies. Not just to separate us from them, but to keep us from discovering what he was doing behind everyone's back. Elena stood up so fast, Nora nearly slipped from her lap. I moved instantly, catching the child before anything could happen. "Elena," I said. But she was already walking toward her brother. "You told our father I chose a poor life?" she said, her voice shaking with fury. "While you were emptying his accounts?" Marcus lifted his hands, palms out. "It's not what you think." That sentence was so weak, so laughable, that even Diane made a sound of disgust. "What is it then?" Elena asked. "Explain it to me." Marcus looked at Richard, then at the envelope, then back to Elena. "Dad was making irrational decisions," he said. "The business was losing value. I moved money to stabilize things." "By stealing it into your own companies?" Richard barked. Marcus snapped back. "You were going to lose everything anyway." The room erupted for a second. Diane gasped. Elena's face went white. Richard gripped the armrest so hard his knuckles turned pale. I felt Nora bury her face into my shoulder. Marcus shoved forward half a step, panic and anger finally breaking through all his practiced control. "You all think I'm the villain because I did what had to be done," he shouted. "Do you know how much pressure there was? Do you know what it meant to keep this family standing when everyone else was busy pretending morality paid the bills?" Richard glared at him. "You were supposed to protect the family, not strip it bare." Marcus turned to Elena, desperation now under the rage. "You really think he would have chosen you? He would have turned this whole house over to the first lawyer with a smile and left the rest of us to drown." Elena's voice dropped to something terrifyingly calm. "So you stole before anyone else could?" Marcus laughed, but it sounded broken now. "I saved what I could. By lying to my face, you were gone, and you used that to steal from everyone." He pointed at me. "He put this in your head." That made me laugh once, humorless and sharp. "No," I said. "You did that yourself." I stepped forward until Elena and I stood together, a single line between him and the rest of the room. "5 years ago," I said, "you looked at my apartment and saw poverty. You looked at my marriage and saw a problem you could manipulate. You looked at your own sister and saw somebody too loyal to question you. And you used all of that to hide what you were doing." Marcus's eyes flickered. That flicker told me everything. Richard noticed too. "There it is," he muttered. Marcus turned toward him, face twisting. "You were going to cut me out anyway." "No," Richard said, and there was sorrow in his voice now, deep and terrible. "I was going to make you earn your place. Then I found out you'd already sold it." The line hung there, brutal and clean. Marcus looked like a man, suddenly realizing the floor beneath him had disappeared long before he noticed the drop. Diane pressed a hand to her chest. "Marcus," he rounded on her. "Don't!" She flinched. I hated the way he still carried himself like the room belonged to him. Richard's hand trembled as he set down the papers. Then he said, "I've already called my attorney." Marcus froze. Richard continued, "And a forensic accountant." The color drained from Marcus's face. "You wouldn't," he whispered. Richard's gaze stayed on him, steady despite the pain. "I would," he said. "I did." Elena stared at her father, then at me, then back at Richard, her voice barely above a whisper. "So that's why you asked us here." Richard nodded once. "Yes." My wife looked like she might say something, but no words came. Richard turned to Elena then, and his voice changed. It was still hard, but beneath the hardness, there was something I never expected to hear from him. "Your mother asked me to let it go," he said. "For years. She asked me to protect Marcus, to keep the family name clean. She said if the truth came out, the damage would be unbearable." Diane let out a sob. Richard looked at her with the weariness of a man who had finally run out of excuses for people he loved. "And she was right," he said. "It is unbearable, but lying about it has been worse." Diane covered her face with her hands. For the first time in all the years I'd known these people, she looked less like a matriarch and more like a frightened woman who had been standing in a collapsing room using you, waiting for someone else to tell her whether it was safe to move. Elena's expression didn't soften. It wasn't cruel. It was older than that, more exhausted than angry now. "Did you know?" she asked her mother. Diane shook her head rapidly. "Not all of it. I knew there were missing funds. I knew Marcus was trying to keep things afloat. I didn't know it was this bad." Marcus let out a laugh that sounded like despair. "Of course not. Nobody ever knows until it's convenient." Richard slammed his hand against the chair arm. "Enough." The room went still again. He took a slow breath, then looked at me one last time. "Adrian," he said, "there's one more thing." My chest tightened. He nodded toward the envelope. "In the stack there should be a handwritten amendment. I found it. It was dated 3 months earlier." I read the first line, then stopped. Elena saw my face. "What?" I looked up at Richard, then back down. The words seemed impossible, even though they were right there in black ink. It was a revised family trust declaration, and it named Nora. Not Elena, not Marcus. Nora, my daughter. The room turned upside down in my mind. Richard watched me carefully. "Before Marcus's theft became clear," he said, voice low and rough, "I started looking at what this family was becoming. Elena refused money. You refused my offers. But I watched your daughter. Every time she came here for a visit, every time she laughed in the garden, every time she asked the staff their names and thanked them, I saw something in her this family forgot a long time ago." Elena blinked rapidly. "Dad." He raised a hand to stop her. "I'm not finished." Marcus looked ready to explode, but no one was looking at him anymore. Richard's voice thickened. "I wanted to make sure the estate went somewhere decent, somewhere that might still understand what a home is." I felt my throat close. Nora lifted her head from my shoulder, curious and sleepy. "What is he saying?" I couldn't answer her. Richard looked at my daughter like he was seeing the future instead of the past. "He was leaving it to her?" Elena whispered. "Yes," Richard said. Marcus stared at the paper as if the ink might rearrange itself. "What?" he whispered. Richard's mouth tightened. "I know what you're thinking." "No, Marcus, I did not do this to punish you. I did it because you already punished yourself." Marcus looked at him, wild-eyed. "You can't be serious." Richard's tone hardened. "I've never been more serious." Then he turned, for the first time, and faced the whole room. "When Elena told me she was going to marry Adrian," he said, "I treated it like an insult. I treated it like a failure. I told myself I was protecting her from a future too hard for her. But the truth is, I was protecting my pride. I didn't want my daughter choosing a life I couldn't control." No one said a word. "I was wrong," he said. The admission landed harder than I expected. Maybe because he was saying it with so little left in his body. Maybe because some apologies arrive too late to heal, but still matter because they are finally true. Elena's face changed, not softened. Her father's eyes moved to her. "You built a life I did not believe in," he said, "and it is better than anything I would have chosen for you. You were right to leave." That hit her like a blow. Elena sat back down slowly, one hand over her mouth. I could see the fight in her, the child inside the woman, the part that still wanted to run toward the father who had once shut her out, and the adult who understood that love without accountability was just a prettier kind of harm. Then Marcus did something I hadn't expected. He laughed. Not because anything was funny, because he was done pretending. "You think this is noble?" he snarled at Richard. "You think some speech on your deathbed fixes what you did to this family?" Richard looked at him, calm now in a way that was almost frightening. "No," he said. "The truth fixes it, or at least it begins to." Marcus turned to me, eyes bright with panic now. "You're really going to let him do this?" I met his gaze. "You did this." His jaw flexed. "And you think Elena still wants anything from this family after you dragged her through this mess?" he snapped. Elena rose again, slower this time, carrying Nora on her hip. "No," she said. "I don't want anything from this family." Marcus gave a sharp, bitter smile. "There it is." She kept going. "I don't want the money. I don't want the title. I don't want the image. I don't want the games. I don't want to be bought back with guilt." Richard closed his eyes for a second. "But," Elena said, her voice trembling now, "I do want the truth acknowledged. I want my daughter to know why she grew up without grandparents who should have loved her. I want you to admit what you did, Marcus. Out loud. Right here." Marcus stared at her. She stepped closer, and for a second I saw the little sister she used to be beneath all the years of hurt. "Say it," she whispered. Marcus's face twisted. He looked at Richard, expecting rescue. There was none. He looked at Diane, and she was crying too hard to offer him anything. He looked at me, but I had nothing for him either. Then his shoulders slumped. For the first time in years, the polished mask cracked wide enough for the man underneath to show. "I moved the money," he said hoarsely. "I signed the papers. I used the family name to get loans. I told myself I was keeping things alive, but I knew what I was doing." Elena shut her eyes. Marcus's voice broke further. "I knew I was lying." The room seemed to exhale all at once. It wasn't peace. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was real. Richard nodded once, as if some final peace had settled into place. "Thank you," he said, and that almost sounded more painful than anger. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but even he seemed to understand there was no room left for lies. Then the front door opened again. A man in a dark suit entered with a folder in hand, accompanied by another woman I recognized as the Whitmore family attorney. Behind them were two financial investigators and, to my surprise, a local law enforcement officer. Marcus saw them and went pale. Richard didn't look away. "I told you," he said quietly. "I was done with secrets." What happened next moved fast, but not in some dramatic, movie-like blur. It was uglier than that, more human. The attorney explained the papers. The investigators confirmed the missing transfers. The officer asked Marcus to step aside while questions were sorted out. Diane started crying in earnest. Marcus began insisting there had been misunderstandings, then errors, then accounting issues, then anything but what it was. But the numbers didn't care about his voice. The numbers were patient. The numbers were brutal. And at last, the numbers told the truth. By the time they finished, Marcus's face had gone from anger to disbelief to something that looked almost like terror. Not because he was being caught, because he was finally seeing what he had built himself into. A man who had spent years stealing so much that he no longer knew how to stand in a room without something collapsing under him. The attorney spoke to Richard in low tones. The investigators began asking for access to digital records. The officer asked Marcus to come with them. And there, in the center of the room that had once rejected us, the man who had tried to turn love into weakness was finally powerless. He turned to Elena one last time. "Are you happy now?" he asked, voice raw. I almost answered for her, but she did it herself. "No," she said. "I'm free." That was worse for him than anger would have been. He stared at her, then at Nora, then at me. The contempt he had carried for so long had nowhere left to go. It just sat on his face and made him look tired. Then he was escorted out. The front door closed behind him. No one moved for a long moment. The house suddenly seemed enormous, as if it didn't know how to hold itself together after the lies had been pulled out of its walls. Diane collapsed into the nearest chair. Richard leaned back, eyes shut, breathing unevenly. Elena stood still with Nora in her arms, tears sliding silently down her face. I crossed the room and wrapped my hand around hers. "Look at me," I whispered. She did, and I saw 5 years of hurt behind her eyes. 5 years of building a life in spite of the people who said she couldn't. 5 years of becoming stronger than the version of herself they had tried to keep locked inside their approval. "I'm sorry," Richard said suddenly, and his voice was so faint I almost missed it. Elena turned. He opened his eyes and looked at her with the barest edge of pleading in his face. "For all of it," he said. "For the things I said. For not listening. For making you feel small." Elena stood there for a long time. Then, very quietly, she said, "You don't get to erase the years." "No," he said. "I know." She nodded once, as if accepting that truth was the only thing left. "I won't pretend this fixes it," she said. "It doesn't. I know. But Nora deserves honesty." His gaze moved to our daughter. "Yes," he whispered. Nora, who had watched all of this with the steady, unblinking curiosity children use when they know adults are carrying more than they can explain, leaned toward him slightly and asked, "Are you sad?" Richard looked stunned by the question. Then he laughed weakly, which turned into a cough, then a tired smile. "Yes," he said. "I think I am." Nora considered that seriously. Then she reached out a small hand. "Then you should rest." For a second, nobody in the room spoke. When he finally held out his hand and let her touch his fingers, I saw tears gather in the corners of his eyes. That was the moment the anger in the room changed shape. Not because everything was forgiven, because something had finally stopped pretending it didn't hurt. The investigation took weeks. Marcus was removed from every account he had touched. The paper trail was deep enough that the financial damage was serious, but not fatal. Enough money had been hidden in time for the family business to survive, though not in the way Marcus had imagined. Several properties were sold off. Several contracts were canceled. Several people who had profited from the confusion were forced to return what they had taken. There were lawyers. There were meetings. There were long, ugly conversations that ended with more silence than answers. Diane, to her credit, finally stopped shielding Marcus once the scale of the damage became impossible to deny. She admitted she had seen signs and ignored them. She admitted she had helped smooth over questions because she was afraid of embarrassment more than truth. It was a painful confession, but a real one. Richard's health declined faster after that. I don't think the strain of it helped. Maybe the body knows when a man's finally running out of lies to hide behind. A month after the confrontation, Elena and I received another call asking us to come back. This time, not to the main house, to the garden. Richard was sitting outside in the early evening when we arrived, wrapped in a blanket even though the air was warm. The sky had turned gold at the edges, and the old trees around the property were moving softly in the breeze like they were trying not to disturb him. He looked smaller out there, less like a king and more like a man. Elena stopped a few feet away, unsure. He smiled faintly. "You can come closer." She did. Nora, who had insisted on bringing a drawing she made that morning, held it up proudly. "It's a house," she explained. Richard looked at the crayon drawing with genuine interest. "Is that so?" "And that's me," Nora said, pointing to a stick figure with an enormous smile. He chuckled. "I see that. And that's Mommy and Daddy." His expression changed at that. Warmth, maybe. Or gratitude. She pointed to a small shape in the corner. "And that's the garden." Richard looked at the paper for a long time and said, "I've spent most of my life building houses. I think I forgot how important the garden was." Nora tilted her head. "Why?" He smiled sadly. "Because people don't live in houses alone." She seemed to accept that as obvious and sat down on the stone step beside him. Elena looked at me, and for a second there was a whole history inside that glance. The court papers, the fight, the apartment, the cold family calls, the years of proving we were real, without anybody's permission. Richard reached into the blanket beside him and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to Elena. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." She did. Inside was a single handwritten page, and beneath it, a small house key attached to a blue ribbon. Elena stared. "Dead?" "It's not for me to keep anymore," he said. "The North Cottage. It's yours if you want it." She blinked fast. "I told you I didn't want the money." "It's not money," he said. "It's a place. Somewhere no one can tell you you don't belong." Elena's mouth trembled. I knew what that meant to her. Not because of the estate itself, but because he had finally understood something basic and holy. Belonging is not the same thing as ownership. It is not control. It is not obligation. It is not a trap. It is being invited without condition. She looked at the key, then at him, and said, "Why now?" Richard's answer was simple. "Because I wasted too many years waiting for pride to make a better father out of me." That sentence stayed with me. It still does. He reached then for another envelope and handed it to me. I frowned. "What's this?" He gave a faint smile. "Don't insult me by refusing before you read it." Inside was a set of legal papers recognizing my company as the approved contractor for the estate's remaining renovation work, along with a letter of recommendation and a settlement agreement that finally acknowledged the unpaid damage Marcus had caused to our business. I stared at him. "You're serious?" "As serious as a man can be when he's run out of time." I looked down, then back up. "Why help me now?" He answered without hesitation. "Because 5 years ago, you took care of my daughter when I refused to." I couldn't speak for a second. Elena's eyes filled. Richard looked at her, and for once he didn't hide what he felt. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I only hope I've done enough before it's too late for anything else." Elena stepped closer. I thought she might refuse the cottage key. I thought she might tell him to keep the recommendation. I thought she might let the distance stay exactly where it had been. Instead, she did something I never expected. She sat down beside him on the bench. Not touching, not embracing, just close enough to be real. "You should have said all of this sooner," she said, voice shaking. He nodded. "I know, and you should have met your granddaughter before now." That made him smile in a sad, tired way. "I know." Elena looked out across the garden, then back at him. "But you're here now." His eyes shut briefly. "Yes," he said. "I am." That was the closest thing to peace I'd seen in that family. Not a resolution, not a miracle, just the beginning of honesty. Richard died 4 months later. The funeral was smaller than anyone expected. Marcus was not allowed near the family records, and several people who had once made themselves very comfortable around the estate had disappeared the moment the accountants started asking questions. The old social circle that had once crowded around the Whitmore name with fake admiration suddenly remembered urgent plans elsewhere. Money exposes people. It also abandons them. There were flowers, too many flowers. The kind people send when they don't know what else to do with regret. Elena stood beside me in black, holding Nora's hand. Diane cried softly through the service, and for the first time, it didn't feel like performance. It felt like a woman mourning the wreckage of her own choices, not just her husband, not just her son's downfall, the whole structure she had helped preserve by staying quiet too long. After the service, one of the attorneys asked to speak with Elena privately. I stayed nearby, Nora on my hip. When Elena came back out, she was holding the envelope from the cottage key. "There's one more thing," she said. I searched her face. "Good or bad?" She gave a shaky laugh. "Depends on whether you consider this a gift or an apology with paperwork." Inside the envelope was a revised deed for the cottage and a final letter from Richard. He had included a note saying he hoped the place would become somewhere our family could gather on our own terms. Not under pressure, not under obligation, on our terms. At the bottom, in his handwriting, he had written something simple. For the life I should have respected. Elena read it twice, then folded the paper carefully and held it against her chest. We moved into the cottage that spring. It wasn't grand like the main house. It was quiet, sunlit, old enough to creak but warm enough to forgive it. The windows looked out over a long stretch of grass and a line of trees that turned gold in October. Nora ran through the rooms like she had been born there, claiming corners, calling the porch hers, asking whether she could plant flowers near the path. "You can plant anything you want," Elena told her. And she did. Some people think karma has to arrive with screaming and shattered glass. Sometimes it does. But sometimes karma is quieter than that. Sometimes karma is the moment the people who tried to make you feel small have to watch you build a life so sturdy they can no longer deny it exists. Sometimes karma is a man who once mocked your apartment, leaving you a house. Sometimes karma is a family forced to tell the truth in front of the people they lied to. Sometimes karma is the son who stole everything standing in court, while the sister he dismissed becomes the voice that exposes him. Marcus took a plea deal, not because he suddenly found a conscience, because the evidence was overwhelming. He lost control of every account tied to the scheme, every position he had used for leverage, every illusion he had built around himself. The legal consequences were real, and the financial ones were worse. He had to repay what could be recovered, and what couldn't be recovered became the shape of the ruin he left behind. I did not celebrate. Elena didn't either. We had spent too many years learning that victory means very little if it turns you into the same kind of person who hurt you. Diane eventually came to see Nora on Sundays. At first, the visits were awkward, then quieter, then genuine in small ways. She was never the warm grandmother Nora saw in storybooks, but she tried. That mattered more than I thought it would. People don't always change in dramatic ways. Sometimes they change by showing up when they once wouldn't. She asked Elena once whether it was too late to apologize properly. Elena thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "It's not about being late. It's about being honest now." Diane nodded with tears in her eyes. That's what all of it had come down to in the end. Honesty, not perfection, not a grand apology that erased years. Just the truth spoken out loud by people who had spent too long hiding behind wealth, pride, and fear. As for me, I kept working. The recommendation Richard left me turned into contracts I never thought I'd get. My company expanded slowly, then steadily. I hired 3 people, then 6, then more. Not because I wanted to become rich, but because I wanted to build something that meant the same thing to other people that our first apartment meant to Elena and me. Proof that love and effort can make a life where nobody expected one. Elena became the kind of social worker people trusted before they knew why. She had a way of making strangers feel less alone. Her family used to call that idealism. I called it survival with a purpose. And Nora grew up knowing the whole story. Not the ugly details, not the parts children don't need, but enough. She knew that adults make mistakes. She knew that money can make people cruel. She knew that love is not something families are entitled to control. She knew that her parents chose each other in a courthouse because they believed the truth mattered more than approval. When she was old enough to understand marriage, she asked us why we didn't have a big wedding. Elena smiled at me before answering, because we didn't need a room full of people to make our love real. Nora thought for a moment, then asked, "Did Grandpa ever say sorry?" Elena and I looked at each other. "Yes," she said quietly. "He did." Nora nodded like that settled something important in her mind. "Good," she said. "People should say sorry when they're wrong. Out of the mouths of children, right?" She said it like the simplest thing in the world. Maybe it is. Years later, I still remember the exact feel of that first day back in the Whitmore house. The way the air seemed to tighten around us. The way Marcus tried to wear arrogance like armor and ended up trapped inside it. The way Richard, for all his damage, finally told the truth when it cost him the most. What stayed with me most, though, was not the confrontation. It was the silence after the lies were gone. For so long, I had imagined that if we ever got the truth, it would sound loud, like thunder, like breaking glass, like a door slamming shut. But the truth that changed our lives arrived more like a deep breath after years underwater. It hurt. It still hurt, but it let us live. One evening, long after all the papers were signed and the money was accounted for and the family name had been stripped of the shine Marcus depended on, Elena and I sat on the porch of the cottage while Nora chased fireflies in the yard. She leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had given up back then?" I looked out at our daughter laughing in the grass. "Yes," I said. "Sometimes. And I'm glad we didn't." She smiled softly. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then she said, "My father once told me I was choosing a life beneath me." I turned to look at her. She didn't seem angry when she said it. Just calm, older, steadier. "He was wrong," I said. She nodded. "I know." She took my hand and squeezed it. "We didn't choose a life beneath us," she said. "We chose one that was ours." I let that sit in my chest for a while. Then, from the yard, Nora shouted, "I found another one." We both looked up. She held a glowing firefly in her cupped hands for a second, then set it free. It rose into the evening like a small star refusing to stay captured. I watched it disappear into the dark and felt something in me settle at last. That house, the one that once made me feel like I had stepped into a courtroom where my worth was being debated, no longer owned our story. We did, and in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all. Not that the people who wronged us lost their power, not that the lies fell apart, not even that the truth was finally spoken. It was that Elena and I kept building anyway. We built after the insults. We built after the silence. We built after the court papers, after the stolen money, after the years of being treated like a mistake. We built a home the Whitmores never believed we could have. And when I think about karma now, I do not think of punishment. I think of balance. I think of a man who once thought love could be measured by family approval and discovered, too late, that the deepest love in the world often grows where approval never comes. I think of a daughter who entered a mansion with her parents and left it with a future. I think of a woman who was told she was throwing her life away and instead found the courage to save it. I think of a family that tried to own everything and ended up learning what it means to lose what money can never replace. And I think of the last thing Richard ever said to me, the final time we spoke alone in the garden before he died. He had been staring at Nora as she ran across the grass, laughing so hard she had to stop and catch her breath. Then he looked at me and said,